All right, yeah, so we're all good.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, we can just jump right in. Welcome to our final presentation. Today we intend to, recap everything that's been done in this project and kind of summarize our findings. So for our project, we were tasked with verifying and validating the prescription drug reconciliation process with the goal of improving efficiency and effectiveness of the process. So at the beginning stages, this was actually quite a daunting task as our entire group was new to working in the medical industry, and the amount of terminology and general information that we didn't have understand was very overwhelming. And so in order to learn this stuff, we all leaned, as you guys know, heavily on your expertise and your through the team at CyncHealth, as well as a lot of the literature that you guys provided us. And so as this learning process was going on, we were also trying to define the problem at hand and create some metrics in order to quantify the success of the project. And so we determined that the problem boils down to the lack of indications that's written on prescription drug medication. So when this information is missing from medical records, specifically for newly admitted patients, doctors or physicians or nurses are having to spend precious time out of their busy schedules to track down the missing information. And obviously this causes problems not only for hospitals, but also for the patients themselves. Hospitals are spending unnecessary money on staff wages, and patients are receiving slower and lower quality care as they potentially could be. And so due to these issues, our team decided that it was best to focus our attention on the efficiency and effectiveness of the reconciliation process for our project objectives. So after many meetings and weeks, we concluded that the following project objectives would be both impactful and reasonably achievable given the time frame and resources that were allocated for this project. So our main goals were to reduce the time spent during the reconciliation process of the patient's prescription drugs by 20% and increase the percentage of prescription drugs that receive an indication also by 20%. Now, without knowledge of the current system or prior experience with this process, it was kind of difficult to create objectives that would accurately represent the potential impacts of the project. And so in order to understand the true impact that we could have, we conducted an analysis of the current state, which I will now let Harrison and Connor talk about.
Yeah. So one of the first things that we really wanted to dive into when we got into the current state is we wanted to understand on a process flow, what does it look like when we're talking with you guys, as physicians and as nurses? What are you guys seeing on a daily basis, and a weekly basis, and how can we turn that into something that's understandable and digestible for engineers? And so we did that by using a process flow diagram. And as we went through and took this process flow diagram and went between the team at CyncHealth and the engineering team here, after a couple of back and forth sessions, we finally got something that was understandable and something that we all believe to be very conducive of what the current state was. And one of the really cool things that we were able to see was one of the things is you have centralized databases. So we're really looking at a handful of databases that were decentralized in multiple different areas. They weren't shared. So it was a lack of resource on one side. We noticed that, but really it wasn't the main focus that was impacting the system. What we saw is that doctors, when they were making their initial prescription, they would not always write an indication. And because of the two process flows that we were looking at, the medical reconciliation process and the prescription drug writing process, what we saw is that the prescription creating process was a data input into the medical reconciliation process. What that ended up resulting in is if we had data that was incomplete via the physicians during the time creating the prescription drug process, it led to further time during the medical reconciliation process. So if we required that all doctors during their prescription creation process always make data that is fully complete with indications, it would save time down the line in the medical reconciliation process And over the length of those two processes, you would actually spend less time between both of them. And so that's what we're really wanted to point out, is that the added time of incorrect data or incomplete data, you could see it either way, really resulted in a large variation of time. And we can only really see that. We don't have a big specification of how much time that is. We simply can say that it definitely increases time, and we can show some kind of data supporting that. I'd like to move on to show Connor and how we use a survey to demonstrate some of these data.
For the method sections, just a quick rudimentary recap of what Harrison had touched on is we use the process flow diagrams to better grasp what the medication reconciliation process was. And after we had made some assumptions and set some constraints within the project itself, we decided to implement a survey to confirm those assumptions made and truly validate if the assumptions that we were making were correct or not. The distribution of the survey was handled by the client PDMP, or the PDMP team of CyncHealth, and it was distributed to multiple facilities to better understand the current state of the medication reconciliation process at those facilities. The data was collected from the 25th of February through March 30th of 2022. At that point, I believe we collected around 31 responses. We were able to consolidate a lot of that data to calculate our result and our impact of what our future state would be. The statistical analysis was performed in order to determine the current state of the reconciliation process with that data that was previously mentioned. And we were able to use that data to make some future solutions proposed to the PDMP team as well. And speaking of results, I'll pass it along to Mark.
So down here are results. What we landed on, though it's an uncertain number, just a very substantial statistical insignificance, we ended up landing on an average of $356 per day in projected savings per impacted facility, which equates to a 27.2% reduction in costs for the actual reconciliation process itself. But again, the survey was sampled from a very ultimately narrow number of facilities. Sure, 3 facilities sounds great until you realize that there are 1,100 total facilities from which you could be sampling. So if one of those was a very high volume hospital or one was a very low volume nursing home, that can substantially skew results. So in the future, as Van will tell you, a subsequent project would avoid those problems.
A couple of the lessons learned by the team through this experience is that the widespread survey distribution is hard. It's very hard to get a good number of surveys filled out and received by our team, essentially, to conclude points from. From this going forward, we would need a much larger survey distribution in order to see what is happening in facilities throughout the Midwest. This, as Mark said, would lead to better significance in our conclusions. We would also assume that the medium in which the survey is being conducted would influence the number of response. Since we had sent this out via a web link, people may not be as likely to follow it just due to suspicious things that we've all heard about on the internet, everything like that. So therefore, being able to choose the correct medium for the survey, such as a paper survey, would ease in the completion in the collecting process, because since the paper would be in front of them, they would be more likely to fill out the entire thing and then pass it along. It would also be easier to disperse throughout the entire facility as opposed to sending the file to a select few. As for the discussion portion of this project, the data collected through our survey does support that the available literature that we had gone through. This is because the survey makes it evident that a large number of medical facilities and prescriptions are requiring indications, reconciliation. Just that entire process is very much needed in our current state. in order to paint a clearer picture, the team realized that we do need a much larger survey population, as we had said before, in order to find significance. It would also be worthwhile that going forward that CyncHealth would send surveys out to much larger facilities. This would help us see mostly the extremes for how many patients are coming into a facility, as well as how much time is being spent, since a larger facility will statistically require more time for their reconciliation process. It would also help to see the true savings, because a much larger facility would technically save far more with the requirement of indications. And I will transition on to Harrison with the next steps for CyncHealth.
Harrison, you're muted.
My fault, guys. Sorry.
That's all right.
So there's a lot of really cool things that can come off from this project, and a lot of different ways that this project can be built off of. One of the ways that this group really got to understand the entirety of this project and how it will really be used in the future is understanding what are the next steps and what are the best ways to go. Some of these ways, as we've already talked about, is a much more in-depth survey. And I think it would be really great to see an entire Iowa State or engineering team, anyone along those lines, to put together a more in-depth survey, increase the sample size, and really get into the nitty-gritty of what the actual data is, so that that project can validate some of the assumptions or invalidate some of the assumptions, so that we can uncover the real truth as to what's the correct course of action. Another really great idea for another project is to do direct in-person analysis and be able to speak in person with nurses, physicians, and others as well. To move on as well, to identify an analysis and auditing system. One of the things that we realize is that data is incredibly important here. If we don't have good data going between the two processes, the second process gets very gunked up. We need a way to make sure that the data flowing between those two processes is of high quality. One, for two reasons. One, high quality due to the fact that it's a healthcare system and that data impacts patients, and because of the increased process time. So having an auditing system in place, which some are in place and have been seen, but to go in and validate that they do exist and they're doing a proper job. And if they aren't, how do we modify them, or how do we add to them? On top of that, and also a bigger cost analysis can be done on the back end of the healthcare system via their data systems already in place, to understand what is the true cost of the systems that could be in place by making all doctors make indications during the prescription process. And that ends our presentation. I would like to say thank you to everyone in the call and everyone that's been a part of this project. You guys have helped us as a team grow, and it's been an absolute fantastic experience.